Welcome back to the Tommy Brideson Show. Now, today I wanted to talk about breathing and bracing and the implications that it has on your pelvis position and your rib position. Now, when we're training, I'm going to link this to squats. I think in a conversational standpoint, I think squats is probably the most logical thing to link it to because it just makes sense. But when you've got a bar on your back, for instance, and you're pushing your tension up into the bar, you're trying to keep your chest up. What happens is if you don't have a strong brace, you'll overextend through your back. So what ends up happening is you just end up loading up your lumbar spines. Now, if we look at the pelvis, there'll be a chain of events that happens. So when you're overextended through your upper body, through your rib cage, and you haven't gotten that tension or a good brace at the front, your pelvis will also dump in the opposite direction. So it'll put you in what we call an anteriorly tilted position. And what that does is it has a whole host of effects on joint ranges of movement, the ability to get your knee towards your chest or hit depth in a squat. Even just from a pain standpoint, there's so many implications. So let's break those out a little bit. But, the thing that we want to be doing most is making sure that we get this really strong brace first and then getting air in and intra-abdominal pressure in to really create some expansion through your midsection. Because what that does is it gets your ribs and you get your pelvis communicating with one another. So then you have a lid, which is your diaphragm. You have a base, which is your pelvic floor. And then you have your ab wall. And, there's different groups of abs in there and they all have a slightly different function. But basically, when they're all working together, you've got a little pressure chamber and you get that air in and you draw it in. And as the lungs come down into your chest cavity, it starts to push pressure and create that intra-abdominal pressure through your midsection. Now, on that point, what ends up happening though, it keeps your ribs and your pelvis in more of a neutral position. Now, what that's going to do, so from a joint standpoint at the pelvis, when you're in a more of a neutral position, it means that your actual leg doesn't get caught or impinge on the bone in certain situations. Now, say for instance, I'm really overextended in the squat. I haven't got much of a brace, and I'm in this overextended position. As I go down into the squat, the reality is that I'm so much more likely to have hip pain, have hip impingement. Because my pelvis is dumped forward, my leg will literally hit bone on bone. And that is a functional hip impingement. So it's not actually a structural thing where you have a deformity at the hip. It's more of a position-based thing, and that's something that can be improved on. Now, I see a lot of people come into the clinic and when I'm treating them, and they come in with hip pain and impingements. And obviously you want to treat the symptoms of the hip, but if you look at what is actually the catalyst for this, it's the positioning of the pelvis and the ribs, and it comes back to the brace and it pulls it all together. So one of the big implications of actually being in an overextended position and not having that correct brace and that setup of intra-abdominal pressure is you can get a joint-based issue, which really can actually spiral into a few different things where you could potentially have labral issues. You could potentially grow some extra bone spurs just because it's hitting bone against bone constantly. So getting a brace and bringing that back down really reduces the chances of that happening. Now, from a tissue standpoint as well, when you're in these really overextended positions and you don't have a really strong brace, what the body always does is it creates stability with what it's given. So even if it's not optimal, it will always try and find a way to create a position of strength for you. So what it will do is go, okay, well, I feel kind of stable through the lower back. It's a structure that is a bony supported structure. And I feel strong through the front of my hips. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lock down the front of the hips through my hip flexors, through the quads and, the front of the hips. And I'm going to lock down through the lower back and create these passive tension structures. But the issue with this is it then further ingrains a bad position. So what that does is think of this front to back. Your body is a highway. And the muscles on the front and the muscles on the back are meant to have 50% of tension each. But what happens is if you overload an area, you might be holding 75% of that tension, say through the lower back and through the hips. And then what ends up happening is you've got less tension through the front on your ab wall, so say 25%, and your glutes and hamstrings and posterior chain also only have 25%. So this is something that we call this a length tension relationship, but the body can only do so much. So if you're overloading a particular area or you've over-shortened a particular area, there's less tension or less ability to create tension on the opposing side. So what that does from a strength standpoint is you really limit your ability to use your muscle mass. You really limit your ability to, you end up essentially fighting yourself, which is a real issue. You're going down into the squat, you're fighting your hip position, the bony blocks, you're fighting this overloading into certain structures, and then you're actually losing the strength through the areas like your midsection, your brace, and your glutes and your hamstrings and your adductors, which are meant to be doing so much work for you. So you've got all these flow-on effects and implications of not having a really sound brace and a really sound intra-abdominal pressure when you set up for your lifting. Now, if we go further up into the rib cage, for instance, when you've got a bar on your back, relating it back to the squat, when you've got that bar on your back, you're trying to not get pushed forward by it. And you're trying not to sort of lose your position because it's quite heavy. It's sitting on your back. So you're trying to create that extension and that tension up into the bar. But the trick to this is making sure that you get the brace and getting the air in before you unrack the bar, because what that's going to allow you to do is make sure that you set what you want to maintain straight away. So if you're setting your breath, you're setting a brace, and then you stand up, you have a really good chance of maintaining that through the movement. Now, you never want to be on the fly and trying to catch these positions as you go. So you want to set the intent of the movement that you want straight away and try and maintain it and preserve it as much as you possibly can through a lift. Now, if we look at how you actually breathe through the lift as well, when you stand up, say you've created a really strong brace, you've stood up, you've walked out, you've let the weight settle down and you're about to do some reps. Say you do 2 reps and, often you'll see someone go, they'll let a lot of air out, right? Now, you've just spent so much time in your setup creating this really effective brace. And then after 2 reps, you've just completely exhaled and let it all go. Now, because you've got that weight on your back, you're never going to get that air back in. You're never going to get back to 100%. So your aim of the game of when you're squatting or, benching and deadlifting as well is to maintain and preserve the position that you started with and the position that is the strongest position to lift in. And quite often you'll see people, they will do the first 2, 3, 4 reps really well. And then towards the back end of a set, it really starts to fall apart. And a lot of the time it's just because they haven't maintained that position that they started in. Now, if we jump back into the squat and you've got that bar on your back, and every time you do a rep, you fully exhale and then try and get another breath back in. Say the first breath, you let out 10%. The second rep, you let out another 10%. So we're at 80% tension through your midsection. You're going to default into an overextended position as you go through the lift. So the first few reps might be really good. And then the back end, it might be subpar. And then at the start of the set, you're really working your intended muscle groups. You're really in a nice balanced position. But as you get towards the back end of the set, you're just overloading, say, your hip flexors, you're overloading your back, and you're getting pretty jacked up in certain areas. So a superpower of your lifting and a superpower of keeping your hips and also your ribs and your lower back healthy is making sure that when you're lifting, you've got a really strong, sound breath and brace, and you hold and maintain that and try and preserve that for as much as you possibly can throughout a lift. And honestly, when you get that right, your lifting improves, you have less pain, and you recover so much better because the weight distribution is spread across your entire system rather than just overloading certain subsections of your system. Now, that's it from me today. Hopefully see you on the next episode.